And let me begin by just explaining my role in the African Development Bank. So first and foremost, my job at the African Development Bank is focused on overseeing our lending program across the continent. I oversee about $10 billion worth of lending annually. But having said that, with the development assistance from the multilaterals and the bilaterals for Africa generally, let's keep in mind that Africa's GDP is about $2.4 trillion. It is also a continent that is growing extremely fast, growing at over 6% per annum. And in Africa, of our 54 or 55 countries that make up the composition of Africa, depending on where you sit, the African Development Bank has 54 regional member countries. Africa is also a continent where 8 of the largest, fastest growing economies in the world reside. So we can see how quickly, for example, Rwanda is growing at 8% per annum over the last 4 years. Similarly, Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, Ethiopia are growing just as fast. But having said that, I think it's incumbent upon us to remember something that is very, very important. The African continent is getting richer, so GDP continues to grow, but GDP per capita does not. So how is it that the African continent is getting richer, where at the same time, Africans across the board are not becoming wealthier? And this is the dichotomy that plagues Africa more than anything else. A continent becoming wealthier, but its citizens in certain parts of the continent seeing in their own countries growth of GDP, but not growth of GDP per capita. Africa is also challenged by a number of things, and the African Development Bank tries to address them through what we call our high fives. The first of those high fives is what we call our initiative to power Africa, which focuses on energy and power generation, transmission, and distribution. And we focus our support to our 54 regional member countries because as of today, 110 million Africans live without power. And I just want you to imagine that, if you will. 110 million Africans live without power. That is basically the equivalent of Egypt being without power. It is the equivalent of Uganda, Tanzania, Kenya, virtually combined, being in the dark. Now, how is it possible that in the year 2020, 110 million Africans are living off kerosene and candles? Clearly, development cannot take place without the ability to access some form of electricity. Industry will not take root, and you will not get economic development in a continent that is in the dark. So we are focusing our interventions to address the whole issue of 110 million people, as I said, in Africa without power. How can students learn? How can we create an environment conducive for private sector investment? How can we industrialize the continent? How can we push the continent towards prosperity? Second is our initiative to make sure that Africa can feed itself. Africa imports about $35 billion in foodstuffs annually and is on track to import $110 billion worth of foodstuffs by 2025. Now, this is particularly unfortunate, especially in a continent where Sudan alone, if Sudan were able to access and develop the arable land that it has available to it, Africa would be able effectively to feed itself. As it stands now, that is not the case. Africa struggles with its basic ability to produce its own its own food, and to remain viable in certain countries where now we are facing droughts and climate change in volumes that are literally unparalleled. One of the other things we focus on is industrializing Africa, which is our third high five. when I was talking earlier about Africa and the continent getting richer, but countries within the continent where GDP grows in real terms, but GDP per capita is either stagnant or actually declining. Now, of our 54 regional member countries, about 18 of these countries have a populace where people live off less than $2 a day. So GDP per capita basically only allows people to live off $2 a day. Now, obviously, this is particularly problematic for development because, as you all know, labor demand is a derived demand derived from the demand for goods and services. So if people live off $2 a day, that is, they're living hand to mouth, they do not have the ability to consume. And if they don't have the ability to consume, other than anything besides basic staples, they are not sending a signal to the private sector to invest, because who's going to make televisions, shoes, ties, consumer goods of different types if no one is buying them? So at $2 a day, there is no consumption, there is no signal to the private sector to invest. If the private sector does not invest, then you end up in a situation where there is extremely low demand for labor, because demand for labor is a derived demand derived from the demand for goods and services. No demand for goods and services, no demand for labor. So what do we do in these 18 countries where, because people live off $2 a day, there is no demand for goods and services, or very minimal amounts, and in turn, there is virtually no demand or minimal demand for labor? This is where the state has to come in. It is a form of market failure, and has to invest in virtually every area and provide a range of subsidies so people, A, will not starve, people will have access to utilities, and you end up in this vicious cycle of countries that become dependent on foreign aid. We want to break this cycle, and we see value chains as the vehicle for breaking that cycle. So let me explain this further. So if we take West Africa produces about 60% of the world's cocoa and coffee. So if you can imagine, if you will, every time you had a chocolate bar or drank a cup of coffee, 6 of every 10 of chocolate bars you've eaten or coffee, coffees you'd have at Starbucks actually emanate from 5 countries on the African continent. But in those countries, you export the cocoa beans, but you don't make the chocolate. You export the coffee beans, but you don't make the coffee. In Sierra Leone, you export the diamonds, but you don't mount the diamond on a ring and get the value addition that comes from. So the lost value added for coffee, for chocolate, I'll use diamonds as my third example, can vary between 800 to about 1,600%, because there is no manufacture. And the best example of this is Sierra Leone, exporting a 1 carat diamond that it sells for roughly about $100, polished, put on, have the stone mounted on a ring, sold for over $1,000. Who has received that wealth? The people that have received that wealth are the people that have basically gotten that value addition from these particular products. So Africa continues to be a wholesale seller of basically not even intermediate goods, but raw materials. And unless we develop value chains, unless we have a Benin that just doesn't export cotton, but exports textiles, you don't have the wealth and you don't have the jobs. Unless we have an Ivory Coast that makes the chocolate and just doesn't export the cocoa beans, then you lose the value addition and you lose the jobs. The same will apply for virtually every commodity that we speak of. We, in the African continent, sell about 17 primary inputs into making cell phones, but we don't make the cell phones. The value addition doesn't belong to Africa, it belongs to Apple. So how can we right this ship? The only way we can right this ship is to industrialize Africa in a way where we develop these value chains and we ensure an effective avenue for wealth creation for people on the African continent. 18 countries where people live off $2 a day effectively means that development is stifled and that you will not see growth because simply you will not see a private sector response with people living hand to mouth. This is particularly problematic in countries across the Sahel where people live off less than $1 a day, where people live off less than $1 a day and have no access to electricity. They are still living in the dark, living off candles or kerosene, where they have no access to potable water, where people have to walk miles to basically fill up a bucket of water and bring it home. So in countries like the Sahel, what do you see? Well, it should not surprise anyone that people become desperate over time. And there is an Egyptian proverb from where I come from that says, when you look down to your plate and you see nothing, you look up. You look up to God. And so clearly with the radicalization that we're seeing, with the terrorism that we're seeing, it emanates from one simple concept: poverty, and a situation where the quality of life of Africans in 18 nations is simply desperate. So one of our mandates is to improve the quality of life of Africans in a comprehensive fashion. But how do we do that? The only way we can do that in these 18 countries on the African continent is to find a way of not just growing GDP, but growing GDP per capita. So what benefit is it if a country is growing at 5, 6, 7%, but GDP per capita is remaining stagnant or in real terms declining? I mean, China has been able to grow GDP, but has also been able to grow GDP per capita. In our middle income countries, what we tend to see is very fast growing economies. And as I've said, 8 of the fastest growing economies in the world are on the African continent. But what happens when you have growth and a deteriorating Gini coefficient? So what that means is wealth is being created, but is in the hands of the few, not in the hands of the many. So what does it mean when you have growth at 8, 7, 9% per annum, and at the same time, the Gini coefficient is becoming more distorted over time, indicating a lack of evenness of income distribution? What does it mean when, say, 3% of the populace own 85% of the means of production? Trickle-down economics does not work. Wealth in the hands of the 3% may help parts of the economy to grow, but not the economy to grow more generally. So unless we can find a way of addressing the issues of income distribution in our middle income countries, addressing the issue of people living hand to mouth in 18 of our 54 countries, this becomes a particularly problematic continent for the poor. So the other factor in play in this also is that the African continent is not integrated. So the African continent, because of its colonialization legacy, is a continent that was geared to effectively take raw materials and send it to the West, where those raw materials get produced and the value added goes to nations outside the African continent. So all the ports, all the airports, all the land routes, the road systems are geared to moving product, mostly raw materials, to the West and now to the East, to China in particular. Now, what happens in that situation is if you basically make cotton in Benin and there's a textile factory in Cote d'Ivoire and you don't have the road that connects them, the cotton that can be used from Benin to make the textile in Cote d'Ivoire, cotton has to come from somewhere else. And usually it comes from outside the continent. So we have to integrate Africa to create the value chains that in turn create the wealth, that in turn create the employment. And integration, or the integration of the African economy, is key. In the COVID-19 pandemic, this became much clearer of how much of a challenge Africa faced because of COVID-19, not because of the impact of the virus on Africans. Africa has been relatively spared with the exception of 4 countries on the continent. But when China, for example, stopped buying as much raw materials as it was buying in the past, then you started seeing a situation where Africa more generally started seeing economic slowdowns. The raw materials that we export as a continent in less demand, and you can't even sell it to the country next door because you don't have a viable road link. So integrating Africa becomes key to everything we do. That infrastructure is key. That trade that will come from it is key to developing wealth. Financial market integration is also key. And these are things that we are all working on and focusing on in our effort to transform the African economy. The thing that I think is much more important to discuss as we move forward is the importance of understanding that wealth creation is the fundamental formula for development anyway. China has proven that yet again. Asia has proven that more generally. So how do we create wealth in the African continent? And undoubtedly, the way you do so is through value chains, is through regional integration, is through investments in industry. And unless you grow wealth, unless you develop that demand for goods and services to a peg beyond $2 a day, these 18 countries I speak of will suffer hardships as they have continued to do so for decades to come. We have to be able to get entrepreneurs to drive the formation of local value chains. We have to address the issues of inequality. And as I close, and I reach out to your participants, to your students, to aspiring entrepreneurs, I just want to emphasize to everyone that Africa is, in terms of its raw materials, the richest continent in the world. So how can the richest continent in the world also be among the poorest continents in the world? How can we have a continent where the continent's overall GDP grows, but GDP per capita doesn't? So this has to be our mission. Our mission has to be to get 110 million people out of the dark. Our mission has to be to make sure that Africa can feed itself. But our mission has to be creating an Africa where wealth and prosperity reach a point where we can begin to see demand for goods and services that will signal growth, that will signal the private sector to invest, that will signal a transformation of the continent. And this is what we all do in the African Development Bank every day. Visualize how we can create wealth on the continent. But we need the entrepreneurs, we need the people of vision to work with us to make it happen. and from what I see from the list of your keynote speakers, I'm definitely interested in hearing the perspectives of our other speakers on accomplishing exactly this. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for having me.
Knox raised the issue of health and how we can grow the health sector to be, how we can invest in the African health sector to be also a money creating point or a wealth creation point. How can we do that? John also raised the idea of growing the middle class, and which has been raised, you raised the point, it has been raised by our participants. How do we grow the middle class in Africa so that with that middle class that has purchasing power, that can drive the economy, that can strengthen, in terms of civil participation, the institutions perhaps even, of government. How do we do that from your perspective? Khaled, please, you can help us illuminate on those points.
Of course, thank you very much, Faith. So let me first and foremost thank John. I think John's points obviously were points that I agree with, and I think both John and I are Keynesian economists. So on the first point, I think growing the middle class is obviously key. So without a middle class, without that purchasing power, as I said, labor is a derived demand, derived from the demand for goods and services. If you don't have a middle class that is actually consuming, you don't have a signal to the private sector to invest. If there's low demand for goods and services, there's low demand for labor. And as I said, this is the storyline for 18 countries in the African continent. But I'd like to recall just 3 examples, without mentioning the countries involved, to show how the middle class is challenged in the African context. One country which had gone into debt distress found itself having to come up with a debt restructuring plan, and the International Monetary Fund basically came in and offered its assistance through their standby facilities, and in turn, to provide them with the debt relief and the resources they needed to ensure that basically country default would be avoided. The IMF asked that there be more cost recovery for gasoline sales. This country is a net gasoline importer. For utilities such as electricity, where about citizens of that country only paid about 30% of real prices for electricity. By the time they were done, gas prices went up, electricity prices went up, water prices went up. And when I did a very simple econometric regression to see what those prices, and of course, when you raise the prices of gasoline, it does affect the prices of everything downstream because everything is shipped. And so obviously, just to get goods to market, what did that really do to the purchasing power of the middle class? In essence, the average consumer's ability to consume would have dropped on average by about 12%. And that in turn, because consumption goes down by 12%, if the investment response is just as adversely affected, then the demand for labor would also taper off. So, we need a middle class that can sustain wealth creation. But as John rightly put it, economics is about 1 step forward and 2 steps backward. Obviously you have to deal with economic distortions, but when you deal with economic distortions and you push the middle class a peg or 2 below what their typical consumption would have been, because obviously the consumption patterns they displayed did reflect subsidies that had to be addressed to control government deficits, but then it becomes a vicious cycle. So I think we need to find approaches where we don't take away from the middle class, but we actually help the middle class to grow. But John said something that was extremely important on tax collection. So for those of you that do not know, on average in the African continent, taxes, income taxation, and corporate taxation represent across the 54 African countries about 35% of total revenue. 35%. 35%. So the tax base of countries in the African continent on average is very, very small. So typically, if you want to have, when you don't have a private sector response leading growth, you can use the state sector or state enterprises to grow. But to do that, you need revenue. And you're not getting that revenue from taxation. Why are you not getting that revenue from taxation? Well, because number one, poverty, but number two, because the informal sector is so huge in the African continent. If you basically look at the Sahel, roughly 80% of all economic activity is in the informal sector. John mentioned Nigeria. Nigeria, its informal sector is 60% of GDP. And that's when it rebased its GDP based on trying to capture the economic activity of the informal sector and rebased GDP some years back. Its GDP almost grew about 40% overnight. So the one thing I want everybody to understand, because I'll come to the health question in a second, is that when your tax base is so low, to understand this better, let's talk about the big six. So the big six in the African continent are the big six oil producers. Obviously, they include Nigeria, they would include countries like Angola. But without being country specific, one of the big six, 78% of its total revenue, both domestic and foreign, comes from oil. Now, obviously, with COVID-19 and a decrease in the demand for oil and the decline in oil revenues, these big six are now struggling just to be able to maintain essential infrastructure, just to be able to import the foodstuffs that they need for the populace at large. So, of our 54 countries in the African continent, roughly over 26 countries are dependent on three primary exports. Three. So now with the global downturn in the demand for raw materials, if the world demands less oil, then these big six, get their revenues from where? If the world demands less of cocoa because of the recession due to COVID-19, where do you get your revenues? So for countries that are completely dependent on, 1 to 3 primary exports, this is not the basis for the future. For the health sector specifically, the logic makes sense. But where do you get the resources to be able to make those kinds of investments? The only way you can do so is to grow your tax base, and as John said, and the only way you can grow your tax base is to grow your middle class. For those of you that don't know, and so I'm not long-winded, one of the things that's key here is that you have 2 countries in the African continent that still do not allow individuals to own land. And what I mean by that is one country, for example, when you buy land, but all land belongs to the state, and you get a 99-year lease for that land. But if you can't own the means of production like land, how can you leverage it? How can you find a sustainable way forward for just being a farmer or an investor of sorts? So the only way to achieve wealth is to hand the means of production over to citizens so people can effectively trade in means of production to also generate wealth, since you don't have a stock market in which you can do this. The last thing I want to say, per the questions that I've seen, I want everyone to remember that within the African continent, 54 countries, you have 8 countries that have GDP between $8 to $10 billion. $8 to $10 billion. Now, Obviously, that's not in PPP terms, but still, Bill Gates' net worth is $118 billion. Jeff Bezos is worth $182 billion. So, in today's world, does a small island economy with a GDP of $5, $7, $10 billion, does it stand a chance to really develop into something, into a wealth creator? Yes, in Africa we've seen it. We've seen it in countries like Mauritius, where, as John was saying, wealth is at par, if not higher than Asia and in Europe, where GDP per capita is over $20,000. But in other countries where you're really not seeing growth in GDP and growth in GDP per capita, you are caught in the poverty trap of people living off less than $2 a day, and a tax base of less than, domestic tax base of 35%, and you're dependent either on primary raw material exports and how the markets fare, and you're dependent on foreign aid. But I just want to close with the point that John made, because this is important. 54 countries in Africa, every country is different. Every country tells a different story. But what we also don't want is an Africa that is basically bipolar. Maybe there's no term of economic biopolarization. But we don't want an African continent where wealth is concentrated in certain parts of the continent, and where basically wealth just simply doesn't grow. And this is what we're seeing. We're seeing economies taking off. We're seeing wealth creation, and hopefully regional integration can allow that wealth to trickle down. I don't particularly like that term, to the countries that have much smaller GDPs and are mostly landlocked. But with that, I hope I've answered some of the questions that individuals did pose, and I hope my contribution was useful. Back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Khaled. Before I let you go, it's just one question that has been coming through about entrepreneurship. And we know that John raised also the idea of the informal sector as well as Knox. So I just want to bring you in, and I know that the African Development Bank has the entrepreneurship program, and people have raised a few questions there that although there is an advantage to that, the accelerators and the incubators, but also that the process is quite lengthy. And people don't know how to go about it, and maybe it puts people off. And entrepreneurs in the informal sector do not necessarily want to go through this process, or they even know about these processes. So, what is the intervention, particularly on the African Development Bank side, about entrepreneurship, informal sector, and what you've said, and John has said, and Knox has said about growing the informal sector and therefore the tax base through this entity?
Very good, Faith. So obviously, specific to your question, if I were to say to you, to ask everyone in the audience, just to try and imagine this. How many companies on the African continent operate with working capital of more than $1 billion? At last estimate, they were under 100. These are domestic African corporations. So what we see in a lot of countries is the inability of companies on the African continent to go from being sole proprietorships, family-owned businesses, to becoming partnerships, and then to becoming corporations. Now, the reason that is because of the very high level of informality that exists in the largest economies in the African region, in the Africa region. And John talked about Nigeria, and that would be an example. So when the informal sector is significantly large and represents a significant percentage of economic activity, there's always a reason why the private sector wants to remain informal, why they do not register themselves as sole proprietorships, partnerships, and to allow themselves to raise equity through equity markets and become corporations. Either the taxation system is incoherent. You don't know what tax bill you might likely be hit with the following day, so you prefer to be informal. As John was saying, institutional capacity is problematic in the African continent. So a lot of companies would like to keep away from the bureaucracy as much as possible. But with that level of informality, with an informal sector as big as it is, you get this very low tax base. And more importantly, you also get a very bizarre concept that I think everybody needs to understand. So, for example, the IMF says a country is in debt distress when debt crosses a threshold when you divide it by GDP. But what happens if GDP is an incorrect figure? And in most countries, GDP is underestimated because the informal sector is so large that when you survey the level of economic activity, you don't get the informal sector. So Zambia is suffering from this today. A country said to be in debt distress, but when you look at its GDP, it doesn't reflect the reality of economic activity. So we have to get the informal sector out of the blind spot in the economy. We have to get them to be formalized. Can we give a certain number of years of tax immunity? So you don't have to pay taxes for the first decade when you basically register your company. Is there a way, and we propose many ways to do so. But to the point and not to be long-winded again, to close on this, I just also want to explain to everyone participating how bizarre economics can be in the African context. So I'll give you an example, just to close. So with COVID-19, many countries have seen their exports taper off. So many have devalued their currency significantly to see if they can get an upsurge in their exports so they can manage their fiscal distress. So imagine a scenario where a country devalues. What should happen is exports should rise. But what we've seen across the continent, when you've devalued, exports are falling. So exports are inelastic. That is, instead of exports rising when currency falls, your currency value goes down and the demand for your goods goes down. The reason that happens, Faith, is because a lot of your intermediate inputs are imported. So in Morocco, you assemble cars, but you buy kits from Germany. So when you devalue your currency, it's more expensive to buy the kits from Germany. And so in the final product, the vehicle itself, when you assemble it, because you're buying a kit and assembling in Morocco, is now more expensive than it was because you devalued your domestic currency. The kit is now more expensive and your cars are more expensive to sell, and thus you devalued and the demand for your vehicles that you're assembling has gone down. So, with the situation of currency, with the situation of exports, a lot of companies in the informal sector say, well, I'm just catering to domestic demand. I'm just catering to the demand of the local populace. I have no real ambition for growth. I don't want to deal with the bureaucracy. And they don't come out of the shadows. But we are working to see how we can address this issue so we can begin to register the correct levels of GDP, where we can make the informal sectors more formal. Then we get the tax base, and then we get the investments from the state sector that can compensate for the private sector when it can compensate and can also generate wealth. I hope that was clear enough. Back to you, Faith. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you very much.